Last week we addressed the question, who were the Boers? How was it that the militia forces of two small Boer republics, comprised mainly of farmers, gave the British Army such a tough time in the South African War of 1899-1902? Today it is the turn of that British Army. How well equipped were they in 1899? What was their state of preparedness to fight a modern army like the Boers? And make no mistakes, the Boers were a modern enemy. They were made use of the latest technology, and they had an instinctive ability to do the right thing at the right time. My name is Ron Gold, and during this period of lockdown, we're making a series of short videos on the South African War, which will culminate in the Battle of Speenkop, which is not far from where I'm sitting on the veranda of Three Tree Hill Lodge. The early part of the 19th century was successful for the British Army. They were involved in a number of battles in the Napoleonic Wars, and these came to a head in June of 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, where Britain and her allies defeated Napoleon for the last time. They were at the top of their game, they were confident, and they were well led. How was it then that at the end of that same century, when that British Army landed in South Africa to fight the Boers, that none of those attributes seemed to be present? We need to look at what went wrong, and we look at it under four different headings. The first is experience. If one takes a sporting team, for that sporting team to be the best, it needs to compete against the finest opposition it can locate. It needs to expose its own weaknesses. It needs to find out what tactics others are using and adapt theirs if necessary. Armies are much the same. Armies need practice. They need to put themselves against the best. And as far as Britain was concerned, at that time, the enemies of choice would probably have come from Europe. It is a reality that there were no fewer than 56 wars in Europe during the 19th century. But it is also a reality that Britain was involved in only one of these wars, the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. And from the end of the Crimean War, 40 years would pass, more than 40 years, before the outbreak of the South African War. And during that period, those British soldiers who'd been involved in Crimea would in fact have all retired or passed on. So the first thing then is the British Army that lands in 1899 in South Africa were woefully short of experience. The second issue is one of technology. There was a huge explosion of technological development during the 19th century in the military sphere. To give you two examples, at the Battle of Waterloo, the protagonists were using smoothbore, muzzle-loading muskets. These weapons were slow to load, relatively accurate at 30 to 40 yards, with a killing range of perhaps 200 yards. Now, things changed rapidly after that. Rifled barrels made their appearance. The loose ball and shot gave way to cartridges, and the muzzle-loading technology, if it was a technology, was replaced by breech loaders. By 1899, modern rifles had a killing range of nearly 2,000 meters and were relatively accurate at 1,000 meters. The battlefield had got hundreds of thousands of times larger, and British generals didn't really seem to understand this. Let's look at artillery briefly. Napoleon had proved to the world that it was artillery that won battles. And Napoleon's guns had ranges of between 1,500 and 1,500 meters. They fired either solid ball or a crude exploding shell. But that had moved a long way, and by the end of the century, modern field guns have a range, some of them anyway, of over 6 kilometers. and they fired a variety of projectiles, one of which was shrapnel, an airburst, a shell that would rain down iron balls on the enemy below. Nextly, let's look at strategy. Strategy is really the development of tactics, the examining of battles past, finding out how to improve upon that. And that seems to have been neglected in the British Army. Sandhurst had come into being in the early parts of the 19th century, certainly, but it rather seemed that in those early days, Sandhurst was more preoccupied with the parade ground and with ceremonial and with the correct deportment of young officers than it was on examining what had happened in battles and looking at how to improve on those. It is a reality that the first war games in Britain took place on Salisbury Plain in 1898. 1 year before the South African War broke out. It is also a reality that during those war games, the senior British general based at Aldershot, Sir Redvers Buller, was outmaneuvered on a daily basis by junior officers. The last thing we look at is the enemy faced by Britain. In the last 20 years of the century, Britain came up against two formidable enemies. The first were the Zulus. The Zulus, under their warlord Shaka in the 1820s, had developed into probably the finest and most dangerous indigenous army on the continent. That army had grown steadily, and by 1879 they were at the top of their game. And that is when they met the British invasion. Britain would win the Anglo-Zulu War, but on the way to winning it, she would suffer some serious defeats. In particular, the disaster at Isandlwana, possibly the worst colonial defeat suffered by any colonial power during that era. Only 18 months later, the British would face the Boers for the first time in what we call the Transvaal War of Independence, or sometimes the First Boer War. It was a little war. It lasted 10 weeks. 4 battles were fought. But in each one of those battles, the British were defeated. The final Battle of Majuba was a humiliation. The Secretary for War, the Duke of Cambridge, later described it as the most humiliating rout suffered by the British Army in its long and noble history. But reality, I think, was that Majuba did the British a favor. It showed them up as being an army that really was way out of date. And it triggered a second phase of a reform program. The cardinal reforms had sort of petered out a few years before, but now the Secretary for War, Sir Hugh Childers, began a second wave of reform, and a number of things changed. In fact, everything changed. All the gaily coloured uniforms disappeared. No more red coats, no more white helmets, no more doomed colour parties carrying the flags onto the field of battle. No more bands following the soldiers and playing encouraging music. Everyone would be dressed in drab khaki. The British will land in this country with one of the finest rifles of the era. A rifle, frankly, they couldn't change for 50 or 60 years. The .303 Lee Metfords and Lee Enfields. The Armstrong Corporation had developed new field guns, 15-pounders. That army was arguably the most modern and best supplied in the world. Unfortunately, however, one small part of that army had not been reformed, had not changed very much at all. And that was the part between the ears of the generals. There did not seem to be an understanding by those senior officers that the world had moved on. What we will do next week, folks, is look at the run-up to the war, the events preceding it, and the causes.